The desert has a way of erasing those who seek to lose themselves within its depths. Deep in the rugged canyons of southern Utah, where the sandstone glows like burning embers, a single word remains etched into a hidden rock wall: NEMO. It is the final signature of Everett Ruess, a brilliant young artist and wanderer who led his burros into the labyrinth of the Escalante in 1934 and never emerged. How does a seasoned outdoorsman, intimately familiar with the silence of the wilderness, vanish without leaving a single trace of a struggle or a campsite? Was he a victim of the treacherous, crumbling cliffs that define the high desert? Or did he encounter something far more sinister in the isolation of the Great Depression-era backcountry? As we trace the final footprints of a man who claimed he would never be satisfied with a mundane life, we must ask ourselves if the wilderness provided the sanctuary he craved or the grave he predicted. Join us as we step into the dust of the canyon floor to unravel the enigma of the vagabond who chose to become nobody. The atmosphere. The sun hangs low over the Escalante, casting shadows that stretch like long, dark fingers across the Navajo sandstone. This is a land of paradox, where the beauty is as immense as the danger, and where the silence is so profound it feels heavy against the eardrum. In the heart of southern Utah, the earth is split open by thousands of miles of narrow slot canyons and jagged ridges. It is a place that demands respect and offers very little in return. Yet, in November of 1934, this unforgiving landscape became the final canvas for a 20-year-old wanderer named Everett Ruess. He was not a stranger to the wild. He was a poet, an artist, and a veteran of the high country who had already spent years traversing the Sierra Nevada and the coastlines of California. But when he descended into the red rock labyrinth of Davis Gulch, he moved toward a horizon from which no one returns. To understand the atmosphere of this disappearance, one must first understand the isolation of the American West during the height of the Great Depression. While the rest of the country was grappling with economic collapse and breadlines, Ruess was seeking a different kind of survival. He moved through the wilderness with a pair of burros, a small kit of supplies, and a burning desire to capture the essence of the natural world in his block prints and letters. He was a figure of romantic obsession, a young man who wrote to his family that he would never be tied down to the drabness of civilization. He spoke of the desert as if it were a living, breathing deity. In his final letters, there is a sense of prophetic finality. He wrote about the overwhelming power of the canyons and his own insignificance within them. He seemed to be courting the very mystery that would eventually consume him. The physical setting of his final days, Davis Gulch, is a winding, subterranean corridor of rock. It is a place where the walls rise hundreds of feet on either side, narrowing in places so tightly that the sky is reduced to a thin ribbon of blue. It is an echo chamber. Every footstep on the sand and every trickle of water from a seep in the rock is amplified. It was here, amidst the dust and the ancient ruins of the ancestral Puebloans, that the search parties found the first clues. They did not find a body. They did not find a struggle. Instead, they found two burros grazing peacefully in the depths of the gulch, still penned in by a makeshift fence that Ruess had constructed. His gear was still there. His food was still there. But the artist was gone. The most haunting discovery, however, was not the camp. It was a word carved into the soft grain of the rock near an ancient granary: NEMO. This simple four-letter inscription has become the focal point of the mystery. For those who know their literature, it is a clear nod to Captain Nemo from Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. In Latin, the word translates literally to nobody. It is a chilling statement of intent. Did Everett Ruess intend to vanish? Was he signaling his transformation from a man with a name and a history into a permanent ghost of the canyons? Or was the inscription a cryptic marker for something else entirely? The word Nemo appears more than once in the area, suggesting a deliberate path laid out by a man who was increasingly detached from the world of men. When the search began in earnest in 1935, the locals who knew the terrain best were baffled. These were men who had spent their lives herding cattle through the fold, a massive geological warp in the earth that creates some of the most complex terrain on the planet. They knew how to track a man through the sand. They knew how to read the signs of a fall or a mountain lion attack. But Ruess had seemingly evaporated. There were no vultures circling a specific point in the desert. There were no torn clothes caught on the sagebrush. The desert had simply closed its hand over him. This lack of evidence is what elevates the Ruess case from a standard hiking accident to a haunting mystery. It challenges our understanding of how a human being can simply cease to exist in a defined geographical space. The atmosphere of the search was one of mounting dread. As the weeks turned into months, the romantic image of the wandering artist began to sour into something much darker. Theories began to circulate among the ranchers in the tiny town of Escalante. Some believed he had been murdered by cattle rustlers who frequented the remote draws to hide stolen stock. Others whispered about the possibility of an encounter with a lone traveler who wanted his meager supplies. But without a body, every theory was just smoke in the wind. The Northern Crime's perspective on such events is that the wilderness itself acts as the primary suspect. The terrain is a maze of slick rock, a type of sandstone that becomes as slippery as ice when wet or covered in a fine layer of dust. One misplaced step on a high ledge would send a traveler tumbling into a crevice so deep and narrow that they might never be seen again. As we look back at the winter of 1934, we have to consider the psychological state of a young man who was alone for months at a time. The solitude of the high desert is a powerful force. It can lead to a sense of profound clarity, but it can also lead to a dangerous overconfidence. Ruess was known to take immense risks, climbing vertical faces without ropes and venturing into areas where water was scarce. He was enchanted by the danger. He wrote about the stinging beauty of the desert and how he preferred the company of the stars to the company of people. This detachment is a recurring theme in many of the disappearances we track. When the human element is removed and a person begins to see themselves as part of the landscape, the instinct for self-preservation can sometimes flicker and die. The mystery of Everett Ruess is not just about a missing person. It is about the lure of the unknown and the price of total freedom. It is a story that asks what happens when a person finally achieves their goal of becoming nobody. The carvings of NEMO remain as a silent taunt to everyone who has tried to solve the case. They are a reminder that some secrets are kept by the rock itself, hidden in the shadows of the alcoves where the sun never reaches. The investigation into his disappearance would span decades, involving forensic experts, archaeologists, and obsessed sleuths. But it all leads back to that quiet, dusty gulch where the burros waited for a master who would never return. We are left to wonder if the answer is buried beneath the shifting dunes, or if it walked out of the desert under a different name. The silence of the Escalante is absolute, and it guards the memory of Everett Ruess with a cold, stony indifference. As we move deeper into the details of the search and the theories that followed, we must keep in mind the sheer scale of the landscape. It is a place where a man can be a giant in his own mind and a mere speck of dust to the earth. The tragedy of the explorer is often that he finds exactly what he was looking for, even if it is his own end, the soul of a nomad. To understand the disappearance of Everett Ruess, one must first dismantle the image of a reckless boy lost in the woods. Ruess was not a novice or a city dweller who had wandered too far from a trailhead. By the time he reached the red rock country of Utah, he was a seasoned traveler of the American West. Born in 1914 to an intellectual and artistic family, Everett was raised in an environment that encouraged deep thought and creative expression. His father was a minister and his mother was an artist. This upbringing instilled in him a sense of restless curiosity that could not be satisfied by the suburban sprawl of Los Angeles. While his peers were looking for steady work in a collapsing economy, Everett was looking for a way to transcend the mundane. His journey toward the ultimate solitude of the Escalante began years earlier. At the age of 16, he set out alone on his first major expedition. He traveled through the high Sierras, hitchhiking and walking through some of the most rugged terrain in California. He was a nomad by choice and by temperament. He did not travel for sport or for the sake of checking locations off a list. He traveled to find a version of himself that did not exist in the presence of other people. During these early years, he met and befriended famous figures like the photographer Ansel Adams and the painter Maynard Dixon. They saw in him a rare, unbridled spirit. Dixon, in particular, recognized that Everett was not just a hiker, but an artist who used the landscape as his primary medium. The letters Everett wrote during this period provide a window into a mind that was increasingly drifting away from human society. He spoke of the wind as a companion and the mountains as his mentors. His prose was dense, poetic, and often tinged with a strange melancholy. He seemed to possess an awareness that his path was leading him toward a destination that others could not follow. He wrote to his brother Waldo about the stinging beauty of the wilderness and how the comforts of home felt like a prison. For Everett, the northern crimes of the world were not just physical acts of violence, but the slow, spiritual death that comes from conformity. He was running toward the wild as much as he was running away from the drabness of civilization. By 1934, Everett had developed a routine that would define his final months. He would pack his 2 burros with art supplies, heavy books, and minimal rations. He would disappear for months at a time, emerging only to pick up mail or resupply in small, dusty outposts. He had a remarkable ability to endure hardship. He slept under the stars in freezing temperatures and navigated without the benefit of modern maps or GPS. He was a master of his environment, which makes his eventual disappearance all the more baffling. People who knew him described him as a young man with a quiet, intense energy. He was not prone to panic. He was comfortable in the silence of the canyons. It is also important to consider the historical backdrop of the Great Depression. The 1930s were a time of wandering for many Americans, but while others were riding the rails out of desperation, Everett was wandering out of conviction. This distinction is vital for understanding why he was often overlooked by the authorities until it was far too late. A young man with 2 burros was not an unusual sight in the rural west of 1934. He was just another drifter in a country full of them. This anonymity allowed him to slip into the cracks of the map almost unnoticed. He moved through the Navajo Nation and the Hopi villages, documenting the lives of the people he met with a respectful, observational distance. He was always an outsider, a loner by the trail, as he once called himself. As he moved toward the Escalante, his writings took on a more transcendental tone. He began to experiment with his identity. He used several aliases in his letters and carvings, including Lan Rameau and Everett Ruess. It was as if he were trying on different versions of himself before finally settling on the name NEMO. This desire to shed his identity is a key psychological element of the case. In the true crime world, we often look for motives involving money or revenge, but with Ruess, the motive was an internal quest for erasure. He wrote about his desire to never be found and to go on forever. These were not the words of a man planning a return trip. They were the words of someone who was preparing to merge with the landscape. The physical toll of his lifestyle cannot be ignored. Despite his competence, the desert is a relentless adversary. It dries the skin, cracks the lips, and drains the body of its reserves. Everett was often hungry and tired, yet he found a perverse joy in the struggle. He believed that only through intense physical and mental strain could he truly see the world. This philosophy pushed him into increasingly dangerous situations. He would climb vertical sandstone walls just to see the view from the top, often without knowing how he would get back down. He was a man who lived on the edge of the abyss, and eventually, the abyss took notice. The soul of a nomad was a complex mix of arrogance and humility. He was arrogant enough to believe he could survive where others could not, yet humble enough to recognize that the desert owed him nothing. This internal conflict is what makes his story so enduring. He represents the part of the human spirit that wants to walk away from the noise and the politics and the responsibilities of the world. But the desert has no mercy for those who wander too far. When Everett Ruess turned his burros toward Davis Gulch in the autumn of 1934, he was carrying with him years of experience and a suitcase full of dreams. He was at the height of his powers, yet he was also at his most vulnerable. His final interaction with the civilized world occurred in late October. He met 2 sheepmen on the trail and spent a few days at their camp. They described him as being in good spirits, focused on his art and his next destination. He told them he was heading for the canyons of the Escalante River. When he rode away from their camp, he left behind the last human witnesses to his existence. From that point on, he belonged to the desert. The path he took was one of absolute isolation, leading into a territory that was, and remains, one of the most remote places in the lower 48 states. He was seeking a world where he could be nobody, and in the labyrinth of the red rocks, he found exactly what he was looking for. Into the labyrinth. The transition from the open plateau to the depths of the Escalante River drainage is not merely a change in elevation. It is a transition into a different geological era. In November of 1934, Everett Ruess steered his burros toward the Straight Cliffs, a massive wall of stone that marks the edge of the Kaiparowitz Plateau. This region is defined by the fold, a buckled landscape where the Earth's crust has been pushed upward and then eroded into a chaotic network of canyons. To enter this place is to enter a labyrinth of red rock where the sun only hits the canyon floor for a few hours a day. For a young man seeking to disappear into his work, it was the ultimate studio. For anyone else, it was a death trap. Everett was last seen by human eyes near the town of Escalante, Utah. At the time, the town was a tiny, isolated Mormon outpost where life revolved around cattle and survival. The locals who spoke to him remembered a slender, sun-blackened youth who seemed entirely unconcerned with the approaching winter. He resupplied his packs with the basics: flour, sugar, dried fruit, and ammunition for his pistol. He also carried his heavy block printing press and bundles of paper, items that most wilderness travelers would consider an unnecessary burden. But for Everett, these were the tools of his trade. He told the locals he intended to explore the canyons down to the Colorado River, a journey that even seasoned cattlemen hesitated to make alone. As he moved south, the trail vanished into a sea of slick rock. This is where the physical reality of the labyrinth becomes clear. Slick rock is a vast, undulating surface of smooth sandstone that holds no tracks and offers no shade. Navigation requires a keen eye for Moki steps, which are ancient handholds carved into the rock by indigenous people centuries ago, or the ability to read the subtle slopes of the drainages. Everett descended into Davis Gulch, a deep, narrow tributary that winds its way toward the Escalante River. The gulch is walled in by sheer cliffs of Wingate sandstone, rising hundreds of feet toward the sky. Once you are at the bottom of Davis Gulch, your world is reduced to a narrow strip of sand, a few cottonwood trees, and the constant gurgling sound of the stream. The final journey of Everett Ruess was marked by a strange sense of domesticity within the wild. When searchers eventually found his camp in Davis Gulch, they discovered that he had set up a semi-permanent base. He had used local brush to create a small corral for his two burros, Cocklebur and Chocolate. This indicates that he planned to stay in the area for some time, perhaps to complete a series of prints or to wait out a specific weather pattern. The camp was orderly. There was no sign of a struggle, no scattered supplies, and no indication that he had left in a hurry. His diary and his painting kit were missing, suggesting he had taken them with him on a short excursion from which he never returned. The mystery of this final journey lies in the NEMO carvings found near the camp. One was located on a rock near the corral, and another was found higher up in an ancient ruin known as an alcove house. These inscriptions were not the frantic scratches of a lost man. They were deliberate, stylized, and deeply cut into the stone. By choosing the name NEMO, Everett was essentially announcing his departure from the human narrative. In the context of the labyrinth, the name takes on a chilling significance. He was no longer Everett Ruess, the son of a Los Angeles minister. He was a part of the canyon, a nameless entity moving through a nameless land. The labyrinth had not just claimed his body, it had claimed his identity. The weather in November in southern Utah is notoriously unpredictable. While the days can be warm and golden, the nights drop well below freezing. If Everett had been scouting a side canyon and became trapped by a flash flood or a sudden rockfall, his chances of survival would have been slim. However, no evidence of a natural disaster was found at his camp. The burros were healthy but hungry, having been trapped in their corral for weeks before they were discovered. This timeline suggests that Everett disappeared suddenly in the mid-portion of November. He stepped away from his fire, walked around a bend in the canyon, and simply ceased to exist in the recorded world. The scale of the labyrinth is difficult to overstate. Davis Gulch is just one of hundreds of similar canyons that branch off the Escalante River like the veins of a leaf. To search them all would take a lifetime. The search parties of 1,935 focused on the immediate area around the camp, but they were hampered by the sheer verticality of the terrain. There are thousands of small caves, high ledges, and deep crevices where a body could lie undisturbed for centuries. In the Northern Crime style of investigation, we must look at the environmental factors as the primary culprits. The labyrinth is a place of false floors, where sand covers deep holes and blind turns that lead to nowhere. It is a place that punishes the smallest mistake with absolute finality. Some believe that Everett's final journey was not a tragic accident, but a successful escape. There are legends in the desert of a white shaman or a lone wanderer who lived among the Navajo for years after 1934. The labyrinth, in this theory, was not a grave but a doorway. He could have crossed the Colorado River and vanished into the even more remote regions of the Navajo Mountain or the Rainbow Bridge country. But this theory ignores the practicalities of the desert. Even the most skilled outdoorsman needs supplies, water, and a way to transport them. To leave his burros and his primary gear behind would have been a death sentence, unless he had planned a rendezvous that no one knew about. As the searchers stood in the quiet of Davis Gulch in 1935, they felt the weight of the labyrinth pressing in on them. They found his footprints in the mud near a spring, but the tracks simply stopped when they hit the solid rock. It was as if he had taken flight. This lack of a trail is what has kept the mystery alive for nearly a century. The final journey of Everett Ruess remains a story without a final chapter, a map with a gaping hole in the center. He walked into the heart of the stone, and the stone remains silent about what happened next. The search and the NEMO inscriptions. When Everett Ruess failed to send his usual flurry of letters to his family in Los Angeles during the winter of 1934, the silence was initially met with patience. His parents, Christopher and Stella, knew their son's habits. They knew he often drifted beyond the reach of postal outposts for weeks. But as February of 1935 arrived with no word, the patience curdled into a desperate, gnawing dread. The machinery of a formal search began to turn, fueled by the frantic letters Stella sent to postmasters across the Southwest. It was a search that would eventually involve cattlemen, sheriff's deputies, and the local community of Escalante, all of whom descended into the desert to find a young man who had effectively become a ghost. The search officially gained momentum in early March of 1935. A party of local riders, led by experienced cattlemen like Jennings Allen, began scouring the drainages south of the Hole in the Rock Trail. This area is a brutal tapestry of vertical drops and hidden pockets. On March 3, the searchers entered the deep, winding corridor of Davis Gulch. There, they stumbled upon a site that was both a breakthrough and a chilling dead end. They found Everett's 2 burros, Chocolate and Cocklebur. The animals were alive, but thin, surviving on the sparse vegetation within a small area of the gulch that had been enclosed by a brush fence. Nearby, tucked under a protective rock overhang, was Everett's camp. The condition of the camp was the first great contradiction of the case. It was not the scene of a disaster. His heavy kits, his cooking supplies, and his bedding were neatly arranged. To the searchers, it looked as if the occupant had simply stepped away for a moment and intended to return shortly. There were no signs of a struggle with a predator, no bloodstains, and no evidence that the camp had been ransacked by human hands. However, the most vital items were missing: his diary, his painting materials, and his light pack. This suggested that Everett had embarked on a side trip, perhaps a day hike, to find a better vantage point for his art, and had never made it back to his base. As the men fanned out from the campsite, they began to find the breadcrumbs that would haunt the investigation for the next 90 years. Near the camp, etched into the soft red grain of a sandstone wall, were the words NEMO 1934. The carving was precise and deliberate. It was found at the base of a Moki trail, a series of ancient hand and footholds carved into the cliff by the ancestral Puebloans. Further up the canyon, near a natural arch and an old cliff dwelling, they found the inscription again, NEMO. It was a name that Everett had mentioned in his final letters, a reference to the literary outcast Captain Nemo, but seeing it carved into the literal bones of the earth felt like a message from beyond the grave. The word Nemo translates from Latin as no one or nobody. In the context of a missing person case, this choice of alias is deeply unsettling. It suggests a psychological state of total detachment. The searchers, mostly practical men who dealt in cattle and weather, found the inscriptions baffling. They were looking for a boy named Everett, but the rocks were telling them that no one was there. The discovery of these markings shifted the energy of the search from a rescue mission to a mystery. It raised the question of whether Everett had suffered an accident or if he had performed a ritualistic act of self-erasure. The physical search intensified as more men joined the effort. They climbed the treacherous Moki trails and explored the alcoves high above the canyon floor. They looked into every dark crevice and behind every tumble of boulders. They even explored the possibility that he had drowned in the Escalante River, which was running high with winter runoff. But the desert offered nothing but silence. The lack of a body was particularly frustrating for the trackers. Even if a man falls from a cliff, his remains or his clothing usually leave a signature for the vultures or the sharp eyes of a mountain man. In the case of Everett Ruess, it was as if the very air had swallowed him. As the searchers exhausted the immediate vicinity of Davis Gulch, theories began to sprout like weeds in the dry soil. Some of the men believed that Everett had been murdered. There were rumors of wild characters living in the remote canyons, outlaws who might have killed the boy for his pistol or his meager supplies. Others suggested that he had intentionally crossed the Colorado River to live among the Navajo, seeking a life entirely removed from the drabness he so despised in his letters. This theory was bolstered by his fascination with indigenous culture and his stated desire to go on forever in the wild. The Northern Crimes perspective on these search efforts highlights the inherent difficulty of wilderness forensics in the 1930s. There were no helicopters, no infrared sensors, and no satellite imagery. The search was conducted on horseback and on foot, in a landscape where a person could be 50 feet away and remain completely invisible behind a fold of rock. The searchers eventually carved their own names into the rock near his camp, a tradition of the time, marking the date of their failure to find him. These inscriptions, alongside Everett's NEMO carvings, remain as a permanent record of the moment the trail went cold. By the late spring of 1935, the formal search was called off. Christopher Ruess traveled to the area himself, walking the same trails his son had walked, but he found no comfort in the red rocks. He left Utah with the heavy realization that his son had truly become Nemo. The inscriptions in Davis Gulch became a site of pilgrimage for future generations of mystery seekers. But for the family, they were simply a tombstone without a body. The desert had claimed the artist, leaving only a 4-letter word as an epitaph. This chapter of the story ends not with a discovery, but with the haunting realization that Everett Ruess had succeeded in his goal. He had stepped out of the world and into the myth, theories of the grave. The disappearance of Everett Ruess sits at a crossroads where natural tragedy meets the possibility of human malice. When a person vanishes in the wilderness, the mind instinctively reaches for the most logical explanation: an accident. In the high desert, the margin for error is razor thin. One theory suggests that Everett met his end while attempting to scale a vertical section of the canyon wall. The sandstone in Davis Gulch is notoriously friable, meaning it can crumble under the weight of a climber without warning. If Everett had been attempting to reach a high alcove to sketch a view or examine an ancient ruin, a single handhold breaking away could have sent him plummeting into a deep crevice. In a landscape defined by narrow slots and boulders the size of houses, a body could be wedged into a space so remote that even the most diligent searcher would pass within feet of it and see nothing. However, the Northern Crimes perspective must also account for the human element. The 1930s were a lawless time in the remote corners of the West. The Escalante region was a known hideout for cattle rustlers and men who preferred to live outside the reach of the law. One persistent theory suggests that Everett stumbled upon a camp of rustlers or outlaws who were hiding stolen livestock in the deep draws. To these men, a young wanderer with a diary and a penchant for asking questions might have looked like a potential witness or a threat to their operation. Some local legends tell of a conflict over supplies, or perhaps a simple act of senseless violence. There were whispers for years that Everett had been murdered and his body buried in a shallow grave, or weighted down and dropped into the silt of the Escalante River. The motive for such a crime remains the biggest hurdle for this theory. Everett was not a wealthy man. He traveled with 2 burros and a collection of art supplies that would have held little value to a thief. Yet, in the desperate years of the Great Depression, even a sturdy pair of boots, a pistol, or a few weeks' worth of flour could be a motive for murder. There were reports from searchers who claimed they found a blood-on-the-saddle story among the local ranchers, but no physical evidence ever backed this up. The lack of any spent shell casings or signs of a struggle at his primary campsite suggests that if he was murdered, it happened while he was away from his base, perhaps while he was out exploring the riverbanks. Another darker possibility involves an encounter that went wrong with travelers on the trail. In his letters, Everett mentioned meeting several people during his journey, including Navajo shepherds and white ranchers. While he generally spoke of these encounters with warmth, the reality of solo travel is one of extreme vulnerability. Some theorists have wondered if his NEMO carvings were not a poetic statement, but a desperate attempt to signal a change in his status. If he was being followed or felt threatened, perhaps he began using an alias to obscure his identity. However, this contradicts his long-standing interest in the Captain Nemo character, making it more likely that the name was a personal choice rather than a cry for help. The most controversial theory is that of the long walk, the idea that Everett did not die in 1934 at all. This theory suggests that he staged his disappearance to escape the pressures of his life and the expectations of his family. By leaving his burros and his camp behind, he created a perfect mystery that would allow him to cross the Colorado River and start a new life under a different name. Some believe he lived out his days among the Navajo people, marrying into a tribe and forgetting his past. While this appeals to the romantic nature of his story, it fails to account for the fact that Everett was a prolific writer and artist who craved an audience. It is difficult to imagine a man so dedicated to his craft simply stopping his creative output forever. Finally, there is the possibility of suicide. Though his family vehemently denied this, some historians point to the increasingly fatalistic tone of his final letters. He wrote about the beauty of the desert being so intense that it was almost painful, and he expressed a desire to be absorbed by the wilderness. If he felt he had reached the peak of his artistic and spiritual journey, he might have chosen to walk into a remote area and wait for the end. This would explain the lack of a body and the deliberate NEMO inscriptions. In this scenario, the desert was not his murderer, but his accomplice. Whether he fell, was pushed, or walked willingly into the shadows, the theory of the grave remains an open wound in the history of the American West. The 2009 false hope. For 75 years, the case of Everett Ruess remained a cold trail, a ghostly legend whispered around desert campfires. This changed in 2009 when the world believed the mystery had finally been solved. The catalyst was a story told by an elderly Navajo man named Daisy Johnson. He claimed that in the 1930s, he had witnessed 3 Ute men kill a young traveler in the Comb Ridge area. According to the account, the traveler had been chased down and murdered for his burros. Johnson pointed toward a remote crevice in the rock where he believed the remains had been hidden. When investigators arrived at the site, they did indeed find a skeleton tucked away in a narrow stone grave, accompanied by a few meager artifacts. Initial forensic testing seemed to confirm the impossible. A team of researchers from the University of Colorado and a celebrity forensic dentist compared the skull to photographs of Ruess. They utilized computer modeling to overlay his facial features onto the bone structure. The results were announced by National Geographic. The DNA and the physical measurements matched. It appeared the mystery of the NEMO carvings was over. The narrative shifted from a poetic disappearance to a brutal crime of the Great Depression. The Ruess family began to prepare for a final burial, believing they could finally lay the spirit of their wandering son to rest. However, the Northern Crimes style of investigation teaches us that science is only as good as its latest peer review. Skepticism began to arise almost immediately among other experts. A different set of DNA specialists from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology and the University of North Texas decided to conduct their own independent analysis. Their findings were a devastating blow to the 2009 discovery. The new tests revealed that the remains were not those of a white male of European descent. Instead, the DNA showed that the body belonged to a young Native American man who had likely died long before Ruess ever set foot in Utah. The 2009 breakthrough was officially debunked, leaving a trail of embarrassment for the initial researchers. This false hope served as a reminder that the desert does not give up its secrets easily. The mystery returned to its original state: a young man, a pair of burros, and a word carved in stone. The enduring mystery of Everett Ruess has transformed from a simple missing persons case into a foundational myth of the American wilderness. Today, the name NEMO is more than just a literary reference or a signature in the dust. It represents the ultimate human desire to break free from the constraints of a structured society and merge with the raw, indifferent power of nature. Ruess has become a patron saint for the restless, inspiring writers like John Krakauer and countless modern adventurers who seek the same stinging beauty that he described in his final letters. His story serves as a mirror, reflecting our own fascinations with isolation, artistic purity, and the high cost of total freedom. The desert of the Escalante remains as vast and silent as it was in 1934. Despite the advent of satellite mapping and high-tech search gear, the rugged canyons still hold their secrets. Every few years, rumors surface of a new discovery, a weathered boot, a rusted pistol, or a pile of sun-bleached bones, but none have ever led back to Everett. The absence of a resolution is, in many ways, the most fitting end for a man who wanted to become nobody. If he had been found, he would be a statistic. Because he remains lost, he is immortal. As we look at the red rock walls today, the question remains, did the wilderness provide the sanctuary he craved, or the grave he predicted? Perhaps the answer lies in the very act of asking. The enigma of Everett Ruess ensures that as long as there are wild places left to explore, there will be those who look into the shadows of the canyons and wonder if he is still out there, walking just beyond the reach of the light.